My name is Nancy Murphy. I'm a representative from Hillsborough 21, the town of Merrimack. I'm sorry. You want to? Oh, okay. Thank you. I have some. Should I hand these out? Sure. You can have some. I'm going to try.
It's quiz at 1 o'clock.
I'm here to introduce House Bill 737, establishing a commission to investigate and analyze environmental and public health impacts related to the releases of perfluorinated chemicals in air, soil, and groundwater in southern New Hampshire communities. Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics is a multi-billion-dollar multinational company and the world's leading producer of engineered high-performance polymer products. They moved to my community, the town of Merrimack, in 2002. Saint-Gobain left Bedford, Vermont, and doubled the size of its plant here in southern New Hampshire. The plant manager told the local paper that one of the reasons for the move was that Vermont's pollution regulations were more demanding than New Hampshire's. Internal plant correspondence, included within the packets I've submitted, stated the air emissions operated in Merrimack without catalytic controls, saving Saint-Gobain an estimated $50,000 per year. In March 2016, Saint-Gobain reported to New Hampshire DES that PFOA, one of the many chemicals included within the PFAS family of chemical compounds, a synthetic toxic chemical used in their industrial processing, was detected in 4 of their drinking water faucets within the facility, which is served by the Merrimack Village District, our water system. PFOA, which is used in the manufacture of Teflon, had been detected in Hoosick Falls, New York water supply and in some private wells in North Bennington, Vermont, notably both near other Saint-Gobain facilities. After investigating the contamination, New Hampshire DES determined that approximately 14.7 square miles of aquifer has been contaminated by airborne PFAS emissions, and it's suspected that up to approximately 65 square miles of aquifer has been contaminated. This PFAS release represents the largest known industry-related environmental disaster in the state's history. And in my mind, we should be treating it like one. Since discovery, what's now with 3 years of ongoing testing of water, air, and soil samples for PFOA and many of the other PFAS chemicals, which is a class of toxic substances. It was also when our community began to realize that the multiple impacts of PFAS contamination would continue to reverberate and have serious implications in all of our lives. PFAS has been found in our community's public water supplies, private wells, and groundwater. 2 of my town's public water supply wells were and remain shut down as testing indicated the PFAS levels exceeded federal advisory levels for safety. Saint-Gobain, the identified polluter by the state, has entered into an agreement to construct and fund filtration for a period of 5 years. Unfortunately, given the biodegradation properties of these substances, PFAS will remain in our environment far longer than 5 years. There will be ongoing filtration needs for the wells thereafter that will become the responsibility of the residents, who not only have to live with the risk of negative health outcomes from this environmental pollution, but also have to bear financial responsibility for filtration of these and all the other wells too. Many private well owners in Merrimack, Bedford, and Litchfield have bottled water supplied to them until an opportunity becomes available to connect them to a local public water supply. Some private well owners declined to be hooked up to the public water system in Merrimack, as it too is contaminated. They didn't want to replace contaminated private well water with less contaminated public well water, and fought for the right to have hookup access to other water municipalities. Residents who are concerned about their health and well-being and want to avoid public water are burdened by the cost of purchasing bottled water to drink and cook with. Others that are able to afford it have purchased in-home home filtration systems to avoid that public water use. The cost of both of these are prohibitive for some families, lower income families, or people that rent homes or condos that they're not allowed to put these systems in. Though Merrimack's public water is currently below the 70 parts per trillion federal advisory, these PFAS advisory levels have been lowered twice in recent years when it was determined that prior levels could not be guaranteed to be safe. Years ago it was 400, then it was dropped to 100, now we're down to 70. And as we speak, DES is in a rulemaking consideration of reviewing the MCLs for four of the chemicals to regulate them. Environmental and public health advocates believe the federal advisory is still too high and not sufficiently protective, especially for the most vulnerable populations, pregnant women, young children. There exists disagreement about science in terms of DES right now, and their review of these chemicals, and how best to determine risk of harm. Regulating these harmful, toxic, bioaccumulative chemicals in any way other than as a class is, in my opinion, essentially playing whack-a-mole. Polluters can switch their use of particular chemicals within the PFAS family. So while testing on the four that we're regulating at present, a different four are used to replace them. Because they have such similar properties and are known to be associated with negative health outcomes, residents are rightfully concerned. PFAS has been shown to affect growth, learning, and behavior of infants and older children, lower a woman's chance of getting pregnant, interfere with the body's natural hormones, increase cholesterol levels, affect the immune system, increase the risk of cancer, especially kidney and testicular cancer. And from my own perspective, I live within 2 miles of St. Gobain, and my water that serves my home from our public water supply was primarily from the wells that are the most contaminated that remain shut down. I have 6 children, and of my 6 children, 3 are adopted, so they're not related to me or to each other. Of my 6 children, 3 of them had health issues known to be associated with PFAS exposure. And as a retired nurse, I always say, I recognize that in any population, you will have a certain percentage of health issues that you will see. However, my children don't share heredity. There's no genetics involved. The only thing they share is environment. They live 2 miles from the polluter and they drank that water all their lives. And I would say, don't know soda, have water because it's good for you. Well, I found that otherwise. We must reduce PFAS exposure any way we can, but we're challenged to do that in a community where the polluter continues to pollute and our air, water, and soil continue to be contaminated. People are sick here, yet remain denied access to blood testing and a health study that might actually provide the scientific data needed to tie this exposure to negative health outcomes. Given that Merrimack and the population is around 27,000 people, and communities closest to the site of this industry-related environmental contamination have had long-term exposure, any information gleaned about this subsection of southern New Hampshire would likely yield important scientific data that could be used by other impacted areas to extrapolate data regarding exposure and outcomes, and thus benefit our entire state. The state of New Hampshire must help its citizens deal with a problem that we residents didn't create. We must remember that those who manufacture and use these chemicals here in New Hampshire have never had to be responsible for keeping them safe, nor have they been liable for negative outcomes. Despite the science that shows health harm associated with exposure, corporations are given the benefit of the doubt over citizens, allowing them to continue to pollute, while the burden of proof falls on the victims of the exposure to prove harm. It's time for the citizens' needs to be recognized, and our environment and public health require it. In 2019, the negative impacts of this environmental crisis remain. As a matter of fact, it's actually worse. Merrimack's public drinking water remains contaminated with these toxic chemicals that have very concerning qualities. Residents have paid out of our own pockets for filtration for our public schools to try to protect our children. We're now being asked to appropriate money for PFAS filtration of all of the remaining wells to protect ourselves from ongoing elevated levels of exposure. Children are being diagnosed with cancer, and many residents experience health issues known to be associated with PFAS exposure. It's been 3 years since the initial discovery of PFAS in our public drinking water, and to date, we don't have a clear delineation of the area that's been affected, nor the full extent of the contamination. We don't really know anything about the health impacts upon our affected community related to this exposure. Sources and impacts to surface water from wastewater and other discharges, the adequacy of soil regulation to contain these contaminated materials, and current rules and regulations as regards public health must be further examined. Findings must be analyzed so that prioritized governmental and community actions can be taken. Progress review of agencies and their partners to expedite action and meet community needs is vital. Regulatory controls, agreements, penalties, and regulations must be reviewed and changes made where necessary. The same needs to happen regarding the roles and responsibilities for municipalities, state agencies, and their partners. Too much remains unknown and unresolved. Public health is compromised and will continue to be at risk. Addressing this must be a priority. The commission that would be established under House Bill 767 would almost act as a case manager, so to speak, where all stakeholders would come together to investigate and analyze these environmental and health impacts of exposure and determine where to go from here. This PFAS contamination issue and the problems it creates is a challenging situation for any agency. The goal-focused cooperation and coordination of all members and commission activities would benefit New Hampshire citizens and heavily burdened agencies trying to manage this crisis. Both our state agencies and our citizens need our help. I hope we can give it to them. Please support House Bill 737 and vote on it passed. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Yes,
Representative Murphy, thank you for testifying on this very important bill. Nashua, which borders on Merrimack, has now found traces of PFAS in 2 of our public water sources. Would adding Nashua to the list of cities that are listed in the bill weaken what you're trying to accomplish through the commission in any way?
I'm not a health scientist or an epidemiologist. I would think that my thought with the group that was chosen was this was the primary site of the greatest exposure. We are the largest impacted area, even though the seacoast is impacted in the Pease area. We have a much larger population, and it's been much longer exposure. So I think to keep that area consistent, to really get a sense of what the exposure has been, what the impact has been, given 20 years maybe of exposure. I don't know how that would work. I would certainly take into consideration any the science, any scientist advice.
Follow-up question. So the purpose of this bill is just to explore. The commission could then make recommendations specific to Merrimack, Bedford, Pease, or Nashua.
The goal.
Or anywhere.
Yeah, my hope would be that the recommendations. We are just the seacoast. Is one side, and they have supports that we actually don't have in southern New Hampshire. And as you said, Nashua's starting to see the PFAS in their water. I know Pennachuck is starting to show, because this water knows no boundaries. Doesn't stop at town line, and that's the issue, and that's what we're concerned about. That even for those towns that don't know what it is or haven't heard of it yet, it's coming. It's coming to you once they test for it. And we thought Pennachuck was safe for so long, and we're starting to see an impact there. So I think the benefits of this commission targeting this area is it's an area that has had the same exposure for the same amount of time. I think what's learned from that would be applicable to any place in the state.
Thank you, Representative.
Yes, Representative Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my questions. Is the intent of the commission's charge to look at the public health concerns, or is the intent to also look at ways of mitigating and remediating the situation?
To both. I think to assess. I think there's been a lot of efforts in isolation, and we're 3 years in, and we still have air stacks pumping out PFAS in Merrimack. There was some legislation that came through that requires some protection for us, but it has to go through a process, an application process, and we're 7 or 8 months in now, and where it's been a very slow process, and given the length of time, it just increases impact. Children that are born, pregnant women. So time is of the essence. You know, I believe that it's been too long, and we need a coordinated effort with all of the players in the room, you know, using their strengths and you know, to come to a determination how best to address it, who has to do what. So we're not waiting legislation by legislation. A bill comes in to, now you can get a blood test, or now you can get a whatever.
Good, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Representative Bushway, then Representative Cunningham.
And thank you, Representative Murphy, for taking my question. So back to the issue of other areas of contamination, specifically the seacoast. So do I understand that this commission will, you know, work with, for example, the Seacoast Drinking Water Commission to leverage the work that's being done there, to avoid redundancies, to, you know, to maximize, to optimize the resources that are committing?
Well, I think actually Representative Mesmer is going to probably speak about the seacoast area, but what I would say is, the seacoast area and southern New Hampshire are sort of in two different situations. The seacoast area has impact from a Department of Defense firefighting foam.
Right.
We have an industrial polluter, and there are many avenues of support that are happening on the seacoast that are not happening in Merrimack. So it's a very different, and I think maybe she could probably, I'd probably defer to her to explain and compare the differences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much to the same point that was just made, different types of contaminants. I just think that this is focusing on one specific region, which obviously definitely needs the work. But to learn from other areas of the state, would you not agree that maybe what some, as you mentioned previously, it was a different type of contaminant? Would you not feel that has, you know, should be studied also at the same time and
Oh, I know.
parallel to something?
Yeah, there are somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 PFAS chemicals, and I think in Merrimack, if I'm not mistaken, I think they're finding like 34 at this in our particular community. They have very similar qualities, and I think Representative Mesmer, as a scientist, can speak to that as well. But I think for me, the goal would be to look and see what there is there. Where is it spread? Which way is it going? It's kind of to Nashua. To stop. We need to stop the spread of this. We need to. The best thing we can do for our health is to stop exposure, and we haven't done that yet. And we're 3 years in. We're still being exposed. So that would be my goal. First up is what do we need to do to stop exposure? But I think all of those people, the people that were listed in that commission, those are the people I think that would have the best skills to decide how best to do that, how to most efficiently do that, and how to access the services that we need to do to make that happen.
Okay. Thank you. My point exactly is just I would want to know that other communities have been affected in a very similar fashion. That input would be shared.
That would absolutely be the goal, and I think we're just. I know that there are other communities that are starting to find smaller contamination areas across the country. And, you know, we're not the only one, but we are the largest impacted area in the state. So I think it makes sense to start there because we have we have a 27,000 person health study just sitting there waiting. You know, we just don't have access to anybody that will do it. So I think it's a great starting point, and I think everything that is learned there, I mean, these are the same chemicals. They're going to have this, you know, I would imagine they're going to have the same impact on human beings and human health. So what we will learn, what I would hope learn from this commission is, you know, what do we do in other communities? What do we do to prevent this? How could we not make other communities wait 3 years before they get a scrubber on their air stack to stop exposure?
Thank you.
Any